The sky had closed up like a steel fist. The clouds, thick and low, seemed ready to burst for hours, and finally they did. The storm came down on Phoenix with a fury that gave no quarter, soaking streets, knocking out lights, and filling with puddles the highways that cut through the city's outskirts. Michael Carter wiped the sweat, now turned to rainwater, from his forehead with the soaked sleeve of his denim shirt. He'd just closed up the shop for the night, leaving behind the metallic sound of tools and the smell of grease. He drove his old '78 Datsun toward home, thinking about Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter, and the ham sandwich he'd promised to make her when he got there. Sophie was his whole world. Since his wife died 4 years ago, Michael had become father, mother, friend, and protector. He worked from sunup to sundown, never complaining, never taking time for himself, all for her. But lately something kept him up at night, a pending hearing. In 3 days he'd appear before a judge who would decide whether Sophie stayed with him or was handed over to her biological mother, Rachel, who had disappeared when the girl was barely walking and had now returned demanding rights she hadn't earned. As he drove along a secondary highway, a few miles from the town of Mesa, the Datsun's headlights lit up a figure standing next to a stalled car. It was a woman, alone, drenched, trying in vain to lift the hood of her newer model sedan. Michael instinctively slowed down. Oh, man. Not in this storm, he muttered to himself, hesitating. He was in a hurry, he was tired, but something inside forced him to stop. He backed up and pulled in behind the broken-down vehicle. He got out with a flashlight in hand, covering himself with a beat-up baseball cap. "Everything okay?" he shouted over the roar of the rain. The woman, soaked from head to toe, nodded without much conviction. "I think it just died on me. I don't know what happened. I'm not very good with these things." Her face was pale, her lips trembling from the cold. Michael approached without a second thought. "Let me take a look, ma'am." She stepped aside and Michael quickly opened the hood. The hot steam coming from the engine indicated overheating. Michael did a quick inspection with firm, sure fingers, like someone who's done this all his life. The water kept falling hard, and the flashlight barely gave enough light. The radiator hose came loose. "It's not serious. You got any water?" "In the trunk, I think," she said with a bit of relief. While Michael solved the problem, Margaret Sullivan watched him, not as a judge, but as a woman, as a human being. She'd left a meeting with other magistrates and was heading home when the car stopped without warning. She felt helpless, vulnerable, until this man appeared. There was nothing about his clothes that said lawyer, doctor, or professional, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of something else. Kindness, honesty, one of those rare people who still help without expecting anything in return. Michael finished the emergency repair and asked her to start the engine. The car roared to life as if nothing had happened. "There you go, you're good to drive, but I'd recommend getting it checked out properly tomorrow. That could fail again." She nodded, impressed. "Thank you. Really. I don't know what I would have done without you." "Don't mention it, ma'am. Just don't get stranded out here again. This area gets sketchy at night." She smiled, and for a second she wanted to introduce herself, say her name, maybe ask his. But she didn't. Something stopped her. Maybe the fact that in 3 days she'd see him in front of a courtroom, fighting for custody of a little girl. "Do you have a name?" she finally asked, testing the waters. "Michael. Michael Carter. Nice to meet you." Margaret felt a small flip in her stomach. That name wasn't unfamiliar to her. She'd read it several times in the case documents she was handling, but she never imagined the man in the storm would be the same one. "Nice to meet you, Michael. I'm Margaret." She didn't add her last name. He didn't ask more. They just said goodbye with a nod. Margaret got in her car, started the engine, and drove off slowly, her mind spinning 1,000 miles an hour. Michael, for his part, returned to his car, soaked, exhausted, but at peace. He'd done the right thing, as he always tried to do, no matter the consequences. That night, while heating up some soup for Sophie, the girl asked him, "Why were you so late, Daddy?" "Because I helped someone who needed it. You know, like how you help your classmates at school." Sophie smiled, satisfied with the answer. On the other side of the city, in her apartment with white walls and endless bookshelves, Margaret opened the Thursday hearing file. She looked for a photograph. She found it. And there he was, without a doubt, the same face wet with rain, the same slow and warm voice that had been grateful without knowing to whom. Margaret sat in silence for a long time, with the file in her hands. The man who had just helped her was the same one who would soon be in front of her, begging not to lose his daughter. And although her duty was to be impartial, an invisible crack had just opened inside her heart. The clock struck 11 when Michael Carter arrived at the courthouse building. He wore a well-pressed white shirt, the same pants he used for baptisms and Sophie's school photos, and shoes he'd polished so much the leather looked new, though it wasn't. In his hands he carried a manila folder, pressed against his chest as if that could keep the fear from escaping through his fingers. He climbed the steps slowly, his throat dry. Each step brought him closer to the moment he feared most, losing his daughter. Sophie didn't know. He'd told her he had an important meeting. He didn't want to scare her. But the possibility of never seeing her sleep in her bed again, of not making her breakfast, of not hearing her say, "I love you, Daddy," before going to school, had him on the verge of tears since he woke up. Upon entering the courtroom, his eyes searched for a place to sit. It was a small room, but with big echoes. Every step, every cough, every movement felt amplified. He sat next to his court-appointed attorney, a young and kind man who had done what he could with Michael's limited resources. The main door opened. Margaret Sullivan entered with a firm step, just as she did in every hearing. She was dressed in black, her hair pulled back with surgical precision. As soon as her eyes met Michael's, the air seemed to stop. He recognized her instantly, but said nothing. He just looked down, confused. She also recognized him. The face under the rain. The man who had knelt in the mud to help her without knowing who she was. Now he was in front of her, not as a casual hero, but as a father on the edge of the abyss. Hearing number 312, custody case between Michael Carter and Rachel Bennett, announced the clerk. From the other side of the room, Rachel made her entrance as if it were a planned scene. Expensive dress, hair styled carefully, subtle but evident makeup. At her side, a lawyer in an Italian suit with a leather briefcase. Her expression was cold, calculating. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "we're here because the minor's biological mother wishes to re-establish the bond with her daughter after having overcome a difficult period in her life. She has economic stability, her own home, steady employment, and the support of a healthy environment." Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. Rachel had disappeared when Sophie was barely 2 years old. Never a call, never a message, nothing. Now she returned with papers and promises. Margaret watched him in silence. She remembered the tone of his voice under the storm, the way he asked for nothing in return, the way he cared unconditionally. "Your Honor," said Michael's attorney, "my client has been the sole person responsible for the minor's care for the last 6 years. We have letters from the school, psychological reports, testimonies from neighbors, and, if the court permits, a drawing made by the child herself where she clearly expresses who she wants to live with." Margaret nodded without looking up. She took the documents one by one. Each page spoke louder than any argument. Crayon drawings, crooked letters saying, "My daddy makes me pancakes," or "My daddy takes me to the park on Sundays." There was something pure in this evidence, something that can't be faked or bought. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "With all due respect, those papers don't prove capability, only emotional attachment," her lawyer said. "And isn't emotional attachment what an 8-year-old girl needs?" asked Margaret, without raising her voice, but with a clarity that cut through the room like lightning. Michael looked up, surprised. It was only a second, but he felt something in Margaret's eyes. It wasn't compassion. It was something else. A mixture of respect and tenderness he hadn't seen in anyone since his wife died. The hearing continued for more than an hour. Rachel spoke of her recovery, of therapy, of her efforts. Margaret listened attentively. She didn't judge her, but inside there was a silent struggle. She remembered every gesture of Michael's, his calmness, his patience, his humanity. She remembered how he didn't interrogate her, didn't make her feel inferior, didn't take advantage. And now she saw him there, alone, without resources, but with a truth so solid you could touch it. When the arguments finished, Margaret called for a recess. She needed to breathe. She went out to the hallway and leaned against a wall. She closed her eyes. In her mind, the rain kept falling. Not on the street, but on her conscience. Am I judging as a judge or as a woman? She asked herself. Duty demanded impartiality. But her heart showed her another path, one that wasn't in the codes but was in the truth of people. She returned to the room. She took her place. And although she didn't pass sentence that day, she looked at Michael with a soft and clear firmness. The court will make a decision based on what's best for the minor, and that includes much more than bank figures. Michael didn't understand if that was good or bad. He just nodded with humility. Margaret closed the case file and stood up. Before leaving, her eyes met his one more time. This time they didn't look away. Something was being born there, something that not even the most powerful arguments could bury. The rain from that night seemed to have moved inside Margaret. Although the sky was clear over Phoenix, inside her everything was a storm. Sitting in her chambers with the lights low and the files open on the table, Judge Margaret Sullivan went over again and again every word, every testimony, every look from yesterday's hearing. She held in her hands the power to change a life forever, and that responsibility weighed on her like never before. The advice from her colleagues echoed in her memory. Do the safest thing, one had told her. The mother has more resources, lawyers, backing. Nobody's going to question you if you decide in her favor. But Margaret couldn't ignore what she'd seen, not just in the documents, but in the man she met under the storm, the one who didn't know who she was and still stopped to help, soaked, asking nothing in return. The same one now asking, without saying it, that they not take away the only thing that gave his life meaning. She looked again at Sophie's drawings. A crooked yellow sun, a house, a man with a mustache and a girl hugging his leg. At the bottom, in messy letters, it said, "My daddy takes care of me every day." She closed her eyes. For the first time in years of her career, Margaret felt fear. Fear of failing, fear of being unjust, fear of listening to her own heart and that leaving her exposed. But she also knew that if she stayed silent, she'd betray herself. The next day, the courtroom was more tense than ever. Michael arrived early, as always. His shoes still shined, but his eyes were dimmed by anxiety. He didn't know if he'd sleep that night with his daughter, or if he'd have to watch her leave with a woman who barely knew her. Rachel arrived with the same confidence as the day before. Her lawyer smiled as if the case was already won. When Margaret entered, silence took over the place. "I've made a decision," she announced, without beating around the bush. Her words were slow, clear, without hesitation. After thoroughly reviewing the testimonies, the documents, and considering what's best for the minor, this court determines that Sophie Carter will continue under the custody of her father, Michael Carter. The air was ripped from everyone's lungs. Rachel froze. Her lawyer immediately stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The mother has all the resources to offer a better life. This decision lacks solid foundation." Margaret interrupted him with the calm of someone who knows they're doing the right thing. "This decision is well-founded, not just in documents, but in facts. In 6 years, Ms. Bennett showed no interest in her daughter's life. Mr. Carter has been consistent, present, and affectionate. Emotional stability is also part of a minor's stability. Not everything is solved with money." Rachel, visibly affected, said nothing. She looked down. Michael didn't know how to react. For a moment he thought he'd heard wrong. He looked at the lawyer, at the audience, at Margaret. She watched him, firm but with a soft glow in her eyes. "Thank you," he murmured, as if the words were dissolving in his mouth. "Take good care of your daughter, Mr. Carter," said Margaret. "She has in you what many children don't have, real love." Michael nodded. He left the room walking as if floating, as if a heavy chain had been suddenly cut. Outside the courthouse, while adjusting his shirt and breathing for the first time in days, he heard footsteps approaching. Margaret was there, without robes, without judge. Just her, with her firm and tired eyes. "Ma'am, Judge," Michael stammered. "I don't know how to thank you. I have no words." "You don't need them, Michael," she said, and for the first time she called him by his name with intention. "You already said everything with your actions." Both stood in silence. There was something that wasn't said, but was felt in the air. Michael took from his pocket a small woven bracelet, the same one Sophie had made for him, but that broke weeks ago. "My daughter makes these things all the time. Sometimes she leaves them in my lunchbox so I won't feel alone at work." He looked at her with a mixture of shyness and tenderness. "If you ever want one, she'd be happy to make you one." Margaret smiled. She didn't say yes or no. She just smiled. A small gesture, discreet, but more powerful than any speech. As Michael walked away, Margaret followed him with her eyes. Something had changed in her, not just as a judge, as a woman, as a person. For the first time in a long while, she felt that her calling wasn't in applying the law to the letter, but in finding justice where it truly lives, in people's hearts. And that day, she had found it in the most unexpected place. Spring had arrived in Phoenix like a caress. The trees in the city park overflowed with new leaves. The air smelled of wet earth and children ran between the gravel paths, shouting and laughing as if the world knew no worries. Michael sat on a bench with a worn backpack at his feet. He watched Sophie as she fed some pigeons with breadcrumbs. The girl had grown in those months, not in height, but in maturity. She seemed more confident, more smiley, as if the fear of being separated from her father had completely vanished. He still couldn't believe everything had turned out well. Life hadn't changed much materially. He still worked long hours at the shop, still struggled to make ends meet. But in his heart, everything was different. There was something lighter in his chest, as if he could finally breathe without fear. "May I sit down?" said a familiar voice beside him. Michael turned. Margaret was there, dressed simply, in jeans and a white blouse, her hair loose, and a smile that needed no introduction. "Of course," he responded, quickly moving his backpack aside. "I didn't know you came to this park." Sophie picked it. "She says the pigeons here are less scared than at other places." Both laughed softly. It wasn't a planned reunion, at least not consciously, but deep down neither of them believed it was pure coincidence. Sophie saw them from afar and ran to hug her dad. Then she looked at Margaret. "You're the lady from the trial," she exclaimed with that brutal honesty of children. Margaret blinked, surprised. Michael tensed for a second, but then let out a laugh. "That's right, sweetheart, but now you can call her Margaret." Sophie approached and hugged her without asking permission, as if she already knew her from before. "My daddy told me you're very fair," the girl whispered. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. "Your dad is very brave. I just did my job." That was the first day. Then came others. Visits to the park, invitations to eat tacos at a nearby food truck, long conversations while Sophie played. Little by little, Margaret became part of their days. Not abruptly, but the way light enters at dawn, slowly but inevitable. Michael was always respectful, even cautious. He was afraid to get his hopes up, to think that this closeness was something more than gratitude. But as the months passed, the silences between them became comfortable. The looks longer. The goodbyes harder. One day, while Sophie slept on the couch after an afternoon of movies, Margaret stayed at Michael's house drinking coffee. "I never thought this would happen to me," she said, looking at the girl. "I dedicated so many years to applying the law, to keeping everything under control, and now I'm here, wishing this house would become my house too." Michael looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and amazement. "You also brought justice to me, Margaret. Not just in court. You made me believe there are still good people in this world." She took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it held an entire promise. Rachel appeared again, this time without expensive suits or lawyers. She carried a backpack over her shoulder and a different expression. Honest, broken, with the tired eyes of someone who has walked inside themselves. She asked to see Sophie. She didn't demand. She just asked. Michael hesitated. He was afraid she'd reopen wounds. But Margaret, with that calm that defined her, reminded him, "Forgiving isn't forgetting. It's understanding that we're all made of mistakes, but also of opportunities." It was Margaret who accompanied Rachel in her first meeting with the girl. It was she who held her gaze when words wouldn't come, and it was Sophie in the end who broke the ice. "Why did you leave?" she asked without resentment, just with curiosity. Rachel cried. She didn't know how to give a perfect answer, but she was honest, and that, for some reason, was enough to start over. From then on, life took on a different rhythm. Not perfect, but real. Rachel began to visit Sophie from time to time. Michael no longer saw her as a threat, and Margaret, far from feeling displaced, became a bridge between everyone. On an ordinary evening, while hanging drawings on the living room wall, Sophie took Margaret's hand and her dad's and joined them together. "We're a family now, right?" Michael looked at Margaret. She didn't say anything, just nodded with her eyes full of light. "Yes, sweetheart, we are." Michael's home, which before only had the sound of an old radio and a girl's laughter, now also had the aroma of coffee that Margaret made every morning. The late-night conversations about books, about life, about the future. The house remained humble, but there was something more valuable in every corner. Shared love, dignity, and a quiet certainty that everything finally was in its place. Because true justice isn't always in the books. Sometimes it's found under a storm, in the engine of a stalled car, in a child's drawings, in the hands of someone who doesn't give up. And when that happens, the past and fear don't matter. What matters is what's built together.